All right. The sheet for the Proverbs is coming around. As it comes around, I'm just going to go ahead and start introducing the book. Of course, the whole class is an introduction. Last week we started with the Psalms, and I didn't really get as far as we wanted to. Psalms is just a big book, and it would be great to spend some time discussing some of our favorite Psalms. But at the beginning of the series, we kind of promised that we would do one book a week, and that's what we're going to stick to. We can always come back and hit some of our favorite sections later on if we have time at the end. But we're going to move on to Proverbs. Proverbs is another one of those wonderful books that is just near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, probably because it gives a lot of practical wisdom. There's just a lot of very good advice in the Proverbs and just some wonderful and amazing things that it teaches us. The Proverbs, of course, is an Old Testament book, so it was written in Old Testament times, very hard to date. And it's very difficult to date mainly because of the same problem that we have with the Psalms. It was written by multiple authors. The four main authors of the Proverbs are going to be Solomon, Lemuel, Agur, and Hezekiah, although it's somewhat debatable as to whether or not Hezekiah actually wrote the Proverbs or Hezekiah was the person who simply collected the Proverbs. So, some of that is under debate, but these are the four names that you're going to see primarily within the Proverbs. And as far as, authors or writers are concerned. Now, the word proverb is just simply a Hebrew word, or is taken from a Hebrew word that means to rule or to govern. And that is kind of the overarching theme of the book. Unlike the Psalms, that is varied and kind of jumps around from devotional thought to devotional thought to devotional thought. The Proverbs, even though it seems very disjointed, and even though there are a multitude of topics that are covered, the Proverbs are united, at least in this one particular area, and that is, based on the name, the fact that they are designed to rule over our lives in a very moral or value-driven way. In other words, the Proverbs have at their heart the notion that there is a rightness and wrongness of things. And you're going to find that within the Proverbs, there's very often these stark contrasts. In these wise sayings, there's no gray area. There's typically, I should say, no gray area. There's no middle ground. For instance, people struggle with this one. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, you and I all know that that's not always the case, right? But in the Proverbs, there's this very clear line of distinction. If you do this, this will happen. The righteous will prosper, the wicked will fall. So there's this embedded sense of rightness and wrongness and clarity about morals or morality. And that's kind of the driving force behind the book. It is imparting to the world the wisdom of God that's designed to filter into our worldview and our sense of morality, creating within us this core set of beliefs or values that seep out in every single thing that we practice. And that's kind of the overriding theme of the book. And you'll see that all along the way. The character, however, is still poetic. There's still, Hebrew parallelism. It's still set up in that same type of arrangement. In the Proverbs, there are 31 chapters, 913 verses, and approximately 15,043 words. I just thought that was kind of interesting. Themes for Proverbs, as opposed to topics. Some of the topics are listed below, and we're actually going to skip that and kind of come back to it. But some of the themes, not to be confused with the topics, the fear of God is contrasted with the folly of self-will. This is a number of different topics are going to fall under this particular heading or theme. And among those two, the fear of God is certainly put out in front. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. On the other hand, folly is going to be denounced, and we are going to see that from folly follows suffering and sometimes even death. So they're contrasted, they're compared with one another, and to do that, there are a number of different ways we do that. There's the wisdom of God concerning money, and then there's the fool and his money that are soon departed. There's the wisdom of God in in all these other areas or topics, and of course the folly of the fool. But number two, we have two great problems that are addressed in the book. And then the first one is the moral government of the world. That means that God has given to the world. I realized that was kind of unclear later. But the moral government that God has given to the world, and the duty of man who dwells in the world. Right? So just simply the giving of God's moral commandments. Okay? So let's skip over the topics in Proverbs, because we'll come back to that, and that'll eat up a whole bunch of time. But I want us to get some of the keys first and some of the basics in understanding. A key chapter, a little bit easier simply because we do have an overarching theme. We do have this kind of principle of morality or moral law driving the Proverbs. So it's a little easier for us as opposed to the Psalms to find some key verses, key chapters, key thoughts and ideas. So I've listed mine. Again, you may find some that are different. You may find other places that you like better or sum up the Psalms or Proverbs. And that's kind of what I think of. When I talk about the keys, I'm talking about keys of understanding. If you read this verse, it'll give you the basic idea of the book as a whole. Or this chapter, it'll give you the basic idea of the book as a whole, so that you can, kind of approach the rest of it with a foundation built or an understanding. So I kind of was torn between two, Proverbs chapter 1, and then, of course, Proverbs chapter 8. Let's go and just read a couple of verses from each one. Proverbs chapter 1 is kind of like Psalm 1, sort of just a really good and fitting start to the book. I think whoever arranged these Proverbs from these different sources did a pretty good job in choosing to put this one first. It says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the word of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. That's a pretty good summary for the entire book. But then you can skip over to chapter 8 too, and let's just read a little bit there. It says, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? And essentially what you're going to have in this chapter, and we'll read a couple more verses, is that wisdom that he spoke of in chapter 1 in those first few verses is personified here. It is given the character of a woman who calls out for you to come. Come and hear the words. Come and gain wisdom. Come and listen to the things that I have to say. On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portal, she cries aloud, to you, O men, I call. And my cry is to the children of man. O simple ones, learn prudence. O fools, learn sense. Hear, for I will speak noble things. And from my lips will come what is right. For my mouth will utter truth. Wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the words of my mouth are righteous. There is nothing twisted or crooked in them. They are straight to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. And you can keep going on and read a little bit more about it. So essentially chapter 1 is just kind of the straightforward, these are wise words. These are words of instruction. Will you come and listen? And then here we have the personification of it. in the form of this, woman who cries out everywhere you go, seek wisdom. Seek wisdom, come and understand. So those were kind of the key chapters, and I felt they were sort of on equal footing in describing the purpose and intentions of the book. Chapter 4, verse 23. Go back there. As far as key verses go, there are several, but I kind of narrowed it down to these ones. And I tell you, it was harder to find a verse. There's just a lot of good verses in the Proverbs. The Proverbs had a lot of very good things to say, so this was a really difficult one. But I kind of, like I said, narrowed it down to these three. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23 says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life." And I like that one a lot because I think it points to the source of where everything starts. If righteousness is going to begin, it's going to begin in your heart. If sin which brings forth death is going to begin, it's going to begin there too. So we need to keep our heart with vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. Now go over to chapter 8, and we're going to turn a lot to a lot of passages. Chapter 8, verse 13. We'll read the whole thing, even though it's just the kind of the first part we were looking at. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance in the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. And then chapter 9 and verse 10. Chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Beginning of wisdom. Of course, wisdom is the key word, has to be. It's mentioned 109 times within the book. 109 times. And I meant to go through and count the number of times fool is mentioned, because it's mentioned a lot too. And that makes sense because it's parallelism, and we're talking about, contrasting with the wisdom of God. So we have the natural setup for, the fool. This is wise, this is foolish. I meant to do that, I just forgot all about it. Key phrase, obviously, is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is mentioned several different times in various chapters. Sometimes it's just simply alluded to as an idea that we should heed and be constantly aware of. So, keys to the book, chapter 1, chapter 8, telling us it's all about a book of wisdom. Chapter 4, 4:23, 8:13, 9:10. Basically, if you want to sum that all up into one basic verse, fear the Lord is kind of the heart of that. Wisdom, mentioned over and over. Basic outline, you go ahead and read that. There are many different ways to outline the Proverbs. The best way is the way I couldn't put on here because it's a little bit too long. And basically it's a topical arrangement. That's the way I like to do it best. Because sometimes you'll be reading along and it'll hit, this talks about money. But then it moves on to some other topic because it's just a small part of a larger discussion. And then later on you'll have another verse, that's about money too. So you can actually kind of pull out all these different verses and ideas, and you have really a whole lot about money. You'll have a whole lot about anger. You'll have a whole lot about, temperance and things like that. It's kind of what we did here in the topic section, but in order to deal with that type of outline, it's just a very large thing, and I just didn't have space for it. But this is just a general outline. Basically breaks the book into 4 different pieces. The first part is just seen as general rules for guidance, wisdom and folly explained and compared. And then the second part is wise and foolish sons. The third part, God-given wisdom for conduct. And of course, as you imagine, and as you can see, these are very general, so a lot can fall under each one of these. And then, of course, there's the summary of learned experiences that we find in the final chapters. Let's see. Interpreting the Proverbs. A couple of things we want to consider before we actually get into looking at some of the Proverbs arranged topically. Proverbs are unique. They just like the Psalms. You have to remember that they are poetry. There are figures of speech that are going to be used, and they need to be interpreted as figures of speech. The example we gave last time was, God is a rock. Well, God's not literally a rock. God is a rock in some sense. So in what sense is he a rock? Well, the context of the psalm or the proverb is going to determine, how we interpret that. So we need to be careful about how we look at things that are designed to be, metaphors rather than, literal. One must also understand that proverbs are a collection of thoughts that are generally true, but not always true in the same sense or applicable in all cases. Like we've already mentioned, the Proverbs draw a clear line of distinction between the righteous and the wicked, telling us very often that the righteous will prosper and the wicked will fail. The wicked will see their crops turn to dust, and their cattle die of diseases, and their family slain by the edge of the sword. It wouldn't be surprising to find those things in the Proverbs, but does that happen every time? Even to people who are habitually, wicked people? Some of the most wicked people, sit at the top of the heap as far as things of this world are concerned. It doesn't happen. So, you got to realize that the Proverbs are things that are, generally true. Generally true. And one of the devices that, is used is that kind of stark line of contrast that we use, that the Proverbs use. We need to understand that when the Proverbs say some of these things, it's speaking just like a lot of wise sayings in generalities. Okay? Finally, you have to remember that each proverb is a standalone piece or context. Often they may seem disjointed for that reason, but we do have 4 different authors, probably writing at different times, and their works are separate from one another, although falling under that larger umbrella of the wisdom of God. Proverbs does appear in the New Testament. They do appear in the New Testament. You remember what's the most quoted book in the New Testament? Psalms, yeah. Psalms is the most quoted book, most quoted Old Testament book, most quoted in the, I don't know how you say that, New Testament, most quoted in the New Testament. But Proverbs is quoted a decent bit. Sometimes it's just simply referenced, kind of like the Psalms. The wisdom is there, but the New Testament writer doesn't say anything like, and as Lemuel wrote, or as Agur, referred to. It doesn't, directly refer them, but the wisdom is there. For instance, James wrote a lot about the tongue, right? He wrote a lot about the tongue, and much of what James wrote is mirrored in the Proverbs, but he never references the Proverbs. The ideas are just simply, there a good deal. But as you can see, they cross over a good bit in chastisement, grace to the lowly, be loving to your enemies, in dogs, evil feet, self-esteem, good for evil, sparing words, disrespect for parents, training children, a whole host of other ideas we could probably list, but a lot of Proverbs carry over into the New Testament. Just a couple contextual customs and that we want to go through, and then we'll go back and start looking at some of what the Proverbs have to say about some of the topics, because that's what we didn't get to do with the Psalms, and I hated that we didn't get to do that. But there are some things for us to remember. Remember, the Bible was written in a historical context, and we need to be cautious when we interpret the Bible, no matter what book we're in. We need to be cautious that we're not taking kind of a modern day setting and using it to define for us the meanings that are behind the text. We have to instead find the meanings behind the text and the history within which it was written, and then apply it to what our situation is today. And we can never reverse the two. A lot of people do that, and they they end up working to their own detriment. But just a couple of things to be mindful of. There's a section where it talks about the contentious woman. Chapter 27. You'll probably run across others, but these are the ones that kind of stood out to me that I thought might need a little bit clarified. 27, verses 15 and 16. It says, "A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. To restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in one's right hand." Okay? And then I always thought it interesting that the next verse says, "The iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another." So when your wife is treating you bad, go rely on your friend. I don't know if that's what it's saying or not, but anyhow, it's one of the things you have to realize is that these folks did not live in homes like you live in. They lived in homes that even today you can look and you can see they are flat roofed homes, and today they're far more advanced than they were even back then. They would have been made of materials that would not have been water repellent. And they would not have had, much of what we have today in order to get rid of that water. So what would typically happen is during the rainy season, now you can imagine their rainy season kind of like ours. We've had some pretty solid rains here lately, right? Anyway, can you imagine that type of thing coming? Only, their rains would last like half a day, or sometimes even longer. And what would happen is those ceilings would become saturated with this liquid that is just, sitting there on top of them, and every room in the house would just start to drip. Every room in the house. You go in the living room, it's dripping. You go in the room where you sleep, it's dripping. You go over here, it's dripping. Drip, 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 drip. You ever sleep in a house with a drippy faucet? There's you go to Mount Dora. What's the name of that big hotel that's there? The Lakeside place? No, it's right there. They got the lake. Anyhow, there's this old hotel. I think it's called the Lakeside Inn or something like that. We stayed there one time, and it's very, very nice, but it's really, really old. And it had the faucet that dripped all night long. And it's just a little thing, but it drives you crazy. So just a little bit of background about that. To us it would be kind of a foreign thing, but you're thinking, well, rain, just go inside. Well, during the rainy season, even inside was dripping. And it wasn't a plumbing problem because they didn't have that either. The other one was, and most of us know this section, the virtuous woman section. There's one I want to mention that's not on the sheet, and then one that is. The Near East, the women have never had the same standing as Western women as far as society in general went. They were not viewed the same way. They would not be put in positions where they were trusted. Oftentimes they were seen more as material possessions than a companion, a helpmate. God's ideal for that. So there's just a couple things I want to point out about it. God, at the beginning of this context, through these inspired writers, he says, when he says, well, let's just go there and read. You remember how he opens? What's the first thing we say in the context? Who can find, right? Who can find? And I think that it's probably partly commentary upon society, but partly when you do find this person, they're going to stand out, with a stark contrast. They're going to shine, like a diamond, because it's just so different than what we normally see. Again, women were not treated with respect. Women were looked at as more possessions, not in God's eyes. So to find this virtuous woman is to find something that it would be very, very different and stand out from the society that they lived in. So this is one of those scenarios where we kind of take the passages and look at our world today, and you got to realize that a lot of these things that are mentioned for the virtuous woman here are things that a lot of women in a lot of cultures way back in the time this was written were forbidden to do. They couldn't do a lot of these things. Not all cultures, and certainly that wasn't God's model, but that was unfortunate, but it was true. The final thing I want to point out about this particular context is that we read through this section, and I know, I have known women who've read this and they just kind of walked away. Oh man, how could I ever be that? I don't think that the proverb writer is saying that in order to be virtuous, you have to do all these things. I think that these are things that are descriptive of probably multiple women who display the characteristics that God desires. God desires. I don't know. That's a tall order. There's a lot there. So anyhow, let's flip back over. Let's go to look at some of the topics that are in Psalms. Psalms has some of the best topics. Not Psalms. Proverbs has some of the best topics and comes up with some of the best sayings for them. The one that I wanted to put on there, but I didn't, was it has a lot to say about drinking, about alcohol and the dangers of alcohol. I just kind of ran out of room, and I had to cut it off somewhere. But that was one of the ones I did want to put on there, and I just didn't get around to it. But let's see. Let's just start at the top. Anger. The Proverbs have a decent amount to say about anger. So let's go over to chapter 14. Chapter 14. And you'll notice that these are scattered all throughout the different writings. A man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. So you can look at these two together. Notice the word "and." So it's not comparing the two ideas. It's just simply lumping them together in the same boat. The man of quick temper acts foolishly, and the evil man is hated. All right. A little bit about anger. Look at verse 29, same chapter. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Okay? That sounds a lot like the New Testament, doesn't it? Didn't somebody in the New Testament say something like that?
Quick to hear, slow to speak.
Yeah? All right, we'll look it up later. Chapter 15. Go over to chapter 15. I tried to get them in the best order as I could. Verse 18. Chapter 15, verse 18. Better is a little with fear of the Lord. No, that ain't it. You know what? Skip over that one. Go to 16. That's when I changed it. What? Right, James. Well, that's a psalm, I believe. I have to look it up. 16. Yeah, I changed these lists a couple of times, and some of them may have gotten jumbled. I apologize for that. Chapter 16, verse 32. 16, verse 32. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Now, most of the Proverbs are kind of this way. You read them and you think, that makes sense. And then you read it again and you're thinking, what does he mean? That's the nature of the Proverbs. They're designed to kind of challenge you and compel you to actually sit and think about them. So whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, Well, how would they be better than the mighty? Well, because they have more control, right? I mean, it's if you're powerful but you have no control, well, I mean, what use is that? But if you have that, control of yourself, then that's a real strength. That's a real strength. And then, of course, he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. First part's a little easier. What do you think that means? How do you rule your spirit? Well, it's parallelism, so he's still talking about his temper. He's still talking about his temper or the anger, just using the word spirit. But what do you think he means by then he who takes a city? He who takes a city? Yeah, well, I think it's, again, this is where it's important to remember it's still parallelism. So I think he's still talking about the mighty, only here he kind of adds dimension to it. It's one thing to be mighty, but it's a whole other thing to be mighty and go out and conquer, right? To be victorious. So I think what he's saying is that, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who, rules the spirit or controls himself is the true victor, I think is what he's saying. That's the true path to victory. It's not just about being strong. It's about being strong and controlled on the inside. That's the way I've always taken it. So, again, just as you read these, kind of realize that parallelism is still there. Let's see. Do you want to go through, and do you guys have one you want to do? Because we're running out of time. We can maybe get through one more and look at it. Temperance, the tongue, wealth, pride. Most of us know the ones about pride. There's nothing good mentioned about pride in the Bible. Pride goes before, destruction, the haughty spirit before a fall, and, all of those types of things. Let's do the fools. Let's do the fools. Go back to chapter 10. Again, fool is mentioned over and over. Chapter 10, and we're looking at verse 18. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. Is a fool. Now, why would the slanderer be a fool? Well, what happens to people who slander? Even in our day and age. Slander is a very specific word, isn't it? I'll sue you for slander. Slander is a crime. It is in our day and age. Slander is a criminal thing. And, to engage in that type of thing is just foolish. You're going to bring all kinds of trouble, including, in our day and age, law enforcement and, government and courts, into your life. You probably don't want that. 21. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for a lack of sense. Fools die for a lack of sense. And then let's notice one more. 23. Doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom is the pleasure of the man of understanding. Okay. And that was our second bell. So we're out of time. But I'd encourage you to go through. Look at those verses. Only take a few minutes to go through there and read some of the verses about friendship or fools or pride or strife or all of those things. The Proverbs are just great reading. It's one of those books that most people do not struggle with at all. Even some of the Psalms, when they get into some of their repetition, can be a little bit arduous to read, but most of the Proverbs aren't like that. Proverbs are typically very easy to get through, and you'll find it very, very enlightening. So I encourage you to read the Proverbs and just kind of note some of those things. But that's our introduction. I appreciate everybody's input and time.
Good evening. This past weekend, Bill and Lois went on a vacation, and she texted me on Friday and was saying, we're on our way to the Keys. And I led her in on a little secret road that my dad used to take and told me about. And I'll tell you guys too, but you got to keep it between us. It's called Tamiami Trail. It runs parallel to Alligator Alley, but it's at points 30 miles south, so it's in the Everglades. So it's a better trip for me. She said she wants to see Indians and alligators and animals, and if you've ever been on Alligator Alley, you never see that stuff because it's a big open path with fences, whereas Tamiami Trail is a 2-lane road in the Everglades. And I let her know that when I drive it, I usually drive in the middle because animals just play in the street, and that gives you kind of time to brake. So she put a picture, actually she sent a picture of them stopping playing with gators in the water. Bill wrestled them, and he also went fishing. And then she had a picture of a gator on the side of the road. And I told her she would see a gator on the side of the road. And I said, is that on the side of the road? She said, yeah, it is. And I said, save it, bury it, because I'll pick it up on Sunday. Because for the past 8 years that I've been with Crystal, we've gone down to watch the Marlins play in Miami at least once a game, or once a season. And it just so happened to be this past weekend as well. So as we were driving Tamiami Trail, I was looking for the gator, but I didn't know where it was. So it kind of came up on me pretty quick, so I couldn't stop. So I said, Crystal, text Lois, let her know we saw it, and we're going to get it. So she texted her. So if you've ever watched Sophia, my oldest daughter, she's got a little OCD in her. She runs circles and does those things. She got it from me because the whole trip, all I could think about was mile marker 41, because that's where the gator was right at mile marker 41. So we went to the game, watching the Marlins play, and the game ended. All I'm thinking, mile marker 41, mile marker 41. Well, in the course of the game, the Marlins lost their 4th straight game, and then they fired a manager that I really like right after the game. And then our youngest, Angelina, decided to scream for an hour and a half straight. And it was raining, so I had 2 young kids, so I was a little nervous. So I kind of forgot about mile marker 41. We're driving on Tamiami Trail, and we get to about 37, 38, and I remember mile marker 41. But I didn't remember that it's reversed. So instead of it being Alligator 41, it's 41 Alligator. So we're driving, and I see 41, there's a big black thing. So I slam on the brakes. Luckily, there's no traffic, no cars, and the rain stopped. And I'm looking at it, and I start to unbuckle. I'm gonna go grab that gator, I want the head. But then I start to think a little clearer. It's been there since at least Friday. I go to grab it, my hands will probably go underneath it, get the guts on me. I go to put it on the roof of my car, the juices might flow into the van. I would probably be divorced right now, so I thought, maybe I'll just take a picture. So I took a picture, and I sent it to her. She said, yep, that's the gator. So I'm driving some more. Now instead of 41, I'm thinking gator, gator, gator. And it's not that it was a dead gator, because that stuff doesn't bother me. But I couldn't shake. Gator, gator, gator. I'm driving, gator, gator. And I can't. And then it hits me. That gator's been sitting there for a couple days, has not moved. Is that how we are as Christians? Stuck in the same position, have not moved? And I think God has a sense of humor, because at that time that I realized it, Pink Floyd, Comfortably Numb, was on the radio. And I thought, that's convenient. How many of us are comfortably numb in our situation? And I thought, that gator has to be symbolic of our life. And if you guys remember, I gave a lesson back in September. And it was about my 30th birthday was 2 weeks before. And I said, I dreaded turning 30. Not because I'm not cool anymore, even though I got a minivan afterwards, so I know I'm really not cool. But because in Luke 3:23 it says, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years old, which was my age. So I realized right then, when I hit 30, I got to start moving, And I talked about how Jesus started laying the groundwork for us, and it's for us to finish at 30 years old, where I was. And if you recall, at the end of that lesson, I challenged all of us to to move forward, to start doing things, and that we need to do more as a congregation, individually and together. And in the 8 months since I gave that lesson, how many of us have accepted that challenge? I know the whole, do as I say, not as I do when you're a parent situation, but I have accepted that challenge. For those of you who don't know, I took over the treasury for the church here. And after years of begging from Glenn I finally joined Christian Activities as a stockholder that oversees the camp. And then because I was amazing in the month that I did that, they voted me on to be a board member. And now I'm an assistant treasurer to Melissa. Is that the right title, assistant treasurer? To Melissa. During this week of camp, they trust me enough to teach my first ever Bible class. They only gave me 1 day, and I probably won't want any more, but I'm branching out and teaching my first Bible class. And last night I attended my second straight men's business meeting. So I have accepted that challenge. In James 2:17, we're told, so also faith by itself, if it has not works, it's dead. We can't just keep showing up here to services Sunday and Wednesday and do nothing else. In order to grow in numbers and influence others, we all need to step up. I'm no longer the next generation. I'm this generation. Amen. I don't want anybody to look at me and say, I haven't seen growth. Too many years I've heard that, and I'm tired of it. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Matthew 7:19. And with having kids now, I realize that they're watching me, and they're gonna lead by they're gonna have my example. And just like that gator, are any of you stuck in a spot? Good news is, if I can grow, as you guys know, anyone can grow. We don't have any excuses to be stagnant. So just like I did in September, I challenge us again, if anyone here tonight, to join me and to stop making excuses and to start acting. Jesus has laid that groundwork, and he left us the instructions in the Bible to continue to build upon that which was laid. And now it's up to us to continue that work. If you haven't been baptized and haven't been living up to that commitment, or have never accepted Jesus in baptism, now is the time. Please come forward as we stand and sing.